Okay, before we jump in, make sure to subscribe, like, and drop a comment. Because trust me, you're
Awesome,
gonna
Grace.
want to talk about
We've
this.
got
Something
And I've got to
seriously
say,
cool and
as
downright
usual,
insane for you
I've got
today on
something
Case
super
Closed.
cool for you.
Get ready,
And
this
our
case will
listeners,
blow
of
your
course.
mind.
We're diving into
You
the
seem
$30
extra
million
excited today.
Gardaworld
What are we
Heist.
diving into? A
Well,
robbery
you know how
so
I love a good
smooth,
heist story,
so
right?
perfectly executed.
Today we're
It's
talking
being
about
called
the
the real-life
absolutely
Ocean's 11.
mind-blowing $30
And
million
here's the kicker.
No
Gardaworld
Even the
suspects,
FBI
not
has
a
no
single
This is
clue
one of
how
the
they pulled
largest
it
cash
off.
robberies in recent history. You know what I
Wait,
mean?
$30 million in cash? That's incredible. How does that even happen in today's world with all the security we have?
That's the thing. Well, that's exactly what makes this case so fascinating. The planning, the execution, the sheer audacity of it all. We're going to break down how these thieves managed to pull off this massive score from one of the world's biggest security companies.
I can already tell our listeners are going to be hooked on this one. I know I am.
Trust me, the details of this case are absolutely wild. You won't believe some of the things these criminals did to get away with all that money. It's totally worth sticking around for the whole story.
So, before we get into the actual heist, I'm curious, what exactly is Gardaworld? I mean, I've seen their trucks around, but I don't know much about them.
Oh, Gardaworld is. It's actually a massive player in the security world. They're basically one of the largest privately owned security companies globally. Started back in 1995 in Canada, and they've just grown exponentially since then. They handle everything from cash transportation, which is what we're talking about today, to physical security for businesses, risk management, all that kind of stuff.
Wow, so they're not just the armored trucks we see on the streets?
Not at all. That's just like one part of their business. They actually employ over 120,000 people worldwide and operate in more than 45 countries. It's a huge operation. But their cash services division is probably what most people recognize, right? Those big armored vehicles transporting money for banks, businesses, ATMs, all that.
And how secure are those vehicles supposed to be? I mean, $30 million disappeared, so something obviously went wrong.
That's the crazy thing, Grace. These trucks are designed to be virtually impenetrable. We're talking reinforced steel walls, bulletproof glass, sophisticated locking mechanisms that require multiple people to open. They typically have GPS tracking systems, and most modern ones even have surveillance cameras built in.
So, what about the people who work in these trucks? Is there special training?
Absolutely. The guards go through rigorous background checks and training. Most are actually armed, particularly in the US, and they work in teams, following strict protocols about when and how to stop, how to communicate with dispatch. Everything is proceduralized for maximum security.
I'm guessing there are procedures for the actual money handling too, right?
Oh yeah, totally. The cash is typically stored in specialized containers with additional security features. And there's this concept called dual control that's really important in the industry. Basically means no single person should ever have complete access to the money. You need at least 2 people present for certain actions, which is supposed to prevent, inside jobs.
So with all these precautions, how on earth does someone steal $30 million? It seems almost impossible.
Well, that's what makes this case so fascinating, because either someone found a serious flaw in their security system, or, and this is often the case with big heists like this, they had help from the inside. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, right? First, let's talk about how this whole thing went down.
So, exactly where and when did this heist actually take place? I'm trying to, picture the scene in my head.
So this went down in Toronto, Canada. Specifically, at Gardaworld's vault facility in Mississauga, which is basically this western suburb of Toronto. And the timing is really interesting because it happened on a weekend in April 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic when, there were fewer people around and security protocols were already kind of disrupted by COVID measures.
Wait, they hit an actual vault facility? Not one of those trucks we were just talking about?
Exactly. That's what makes this so bold. They didn't go after a moving target like an armored truck. They went straight for the source, the facility, where they process and store huge amounts of cash. This particular location was responsible for servicing ATMs and banks throughout the Greater Toronto area, so they typically had millions on hand, especially before a long weekend, which is when this happened.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so much riskier than hitting a truck. There must have been way more security at a facility like that.
You'd think so, right? But there were a few circumstances that made this particular facility vulnerable at that time. For one thing, the pandemic had forced them to operate with reduced staff. There were also some renovation works happening in one section of the building, which meant there were contractors coming and going, and some of the security systems had been temporarily modified to accommodate the construction.
So basically, it was like the perfect storm of vulnerabilities.
That's exactly it. Plus, and this is really important, it happened over Easter weekend when staffing was already planned to be lower, and the facility was holding extra cash to stock ATMs for the holiday weekend, so they had more money than usual, with fewer people watching it. Talk about a security nightmare, you know?
I still can't believe how gutsy this was. Did they just walk right in or what?
Well, not exactly. What made this heist particularly clever was that they didn't use violence or some dramatic Ocean's 11-style break-in. The investigators believe the thieves actually entered the facility during normal business hours on the Friday, and then, and this is the wild part, they hid inside the building until after it closed.
They were just hiding somewhere in the building? For how long?
Potentially for hours. They likely concealed themselves in an area under construction, or maybe in a rarely used storage space. Once the main staff had left for the weekend, and just the skeleton crew remained, that's when they made their move. And because they were already inside, they bypassed a lot of the external security measures that would normally detect a break-in.
That's absolutely terrifying when you think about it. So there were still some staff there while this was happening?
Yeah, a minimal security team was still on duty. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some of them were actually tied up during the heist, while others, well, there were serious questions about whether some insiders might have been involved, because certain security protocols were mysteriously disabled right before the theft occurred.
So either they overpowered the guards or had help from the inside?
Or possibly both. The investigation showed that whoever did this had incredibly detailed knowledge of not just the facility layout, but also the exact timing of cash deliveries, the security shift changes, and even which specific rooms held the most valuable shipments. That kind of intel? I mean, it's hard to get that without someone on the inside feeding you information.
So, let's get into the nitty-gritty here. How exactly did they pull off stealing $30 million? Like, that's not something you can just stuff in your pockets and walk out with, right?
Oh, absolutely not. The execution was actually brilliant, in a really disturbing way. Once they were inside and had control of the facility, they targeted the main vault room specifically. And this is where the sophisticated planning becomes evident. They had clearly studied the vault's locking mechanisms because they managed to defeat the time lock system.
Wait, time lock system? What's that?
So, most high-security vaults use what's called a time lock, which means it's basically a mechanism that prevents the vault from being opened until a preset time, even if you have the correct combination. It's designed specifically to prevent forced openings during off hours. But these guys, they somehow knew how to bypass it.
That sounds super technical. Like, you'd need specialized knowledge for that, wouldn't you?
Exactly. And that's another reason investigators are so convinced this was an inside job. The thieves brought specialized equipment with them, custom tools designed specifically for this vault model. They didn't just grab whatever was available, you know? They came prepared with exactly what they needed for this specific security system.
So once they got the vault open, then what? $30 million must weigh a ton.
That's the thing. Cash is incredibly heavy. We're talking about roughly $30 million in mostly $100 bills, which would weigh somewhere around 300 kilograms or 660 pounds. And they didn't just grab it haphazardly. They were extremely selective about which currency bundles they took.
Selective? How so?
Well, they primarily targeted bundles that were sequential and newly minted, which are way harder to trace. And they completely ignored coins and lower denominational bills, which would have been heavier and less valuable for the same weight. These weren't amateurs grabbing whatever they could. This was calculated, and they knew exactly which storage containers held the high-value, non-sequential bills.
Okay, but still, that's like carrying the weight of 2 adult men out of the building. How did they manage that part?
That's where the timing aspect gets really clever. Security footage, what little wasn't disabled, shows that they had a loading dock access point secured. They brought in these large plastic containers, like the kind you'd use for industrial laundry or commercial recycling. And they had a vehicle waiting. believed to be a modified delivery van with the company logo removed.
So they basically just wheeled it out like a regular delivery?
Right. And because it was a holiday weekend, there was minimal traffic in the industrial park where the facility is located. They loaded everything within about 27 minutes, which is just incredibly fast and efficient. They even knew exactly which security cameras to disable and which ones to leave operational to avoid triggering certain alarms.
That's so meticulous. Did they leave any evidence behind at all?
Surprisingly little. They wore what appeared to be standard maintenance uniforms with face coverings, which wouldn't have seemed unusual during COVID. And they used disposable gloves. They even brought plastic sheeting to lay down in certain areas to minimize forensic evidence, like footprints or fibers.
Sounds like something out of a movie. How long did it take before anyone even noticed the money was gone?
Here's the really incredible part. They timed their exit to coincide with a shift change, and they actually jammed certain communications so the incoming security team couldn't immediately contact the outgoing team. It wasn't until early Sunday morning, nearly 36 hours later, that the full extent of the theft was discovered, giving them this massive head start.
I'm honestly speechless. 36 hours is a huge window to disappear with that much money.
Absolutely. By the time a full alarm was raised, they had this enormous time advantage. And you know what makes it even more impressive? They left virtually no digital footprint. They somehow knew exactly where all the alarm sensors were located and managed to avoid triggering the ones they couldn't disable. This wasn't just physical planning, it was technical expertise at an extremely high level.
So who exactly are we dealing with here? Do the authorities have any idea about who might have pulled this off?
This is where things get really interesting, Grace. The level of planning and execution we're looking at. It screams professional criminals with extensive experience. We're not, and I cannot stress this enough, we're not talking about some random group that decided to rob a secure facility on a whim. These people knew exactly what they were doing.
So, like, career criminals then?
Exactly. The FBI and local authorities believe they're dealing with a crew that's likely been involved in other high-value thefts before. And what's really telling is that they haven't been caught yet. These aren't the kind of criminals who make rookie mistakes like flashing cash around town or buying fancy cars right after a heist.
Do they think it was definitely an inside job? Because from everything you've described, it seems like they had way too much specific knowledge.
The evidence pointing to insider involvement is overwhelming. Look at the facts. They knew the exact layout of the facility, the precise timing of shifts, which security protocols were in place, and even which containers held the most valuable currency. You know what I mean? That's not information you can just Google.
Right. And they knew about that time lock thing on the vault too.
Absolutely. The time lock bypass alone suggests someone with intimate knowledge of Gardaworld's specific security systems. Investigators have been looking closely at current and former employees, especially those who worked in security design or implementation. They're also examining anyone who recently left the company under questionable circumstances, or who might have financial troubles.
Have they identified any specific suspects yet?
So far, no arrests have been made public, which is, frankly, remarkable given the scale of the heist. But there are some interesting theories floating around. One prevailing theory is that this might have involved multiple insiders working together, possibly someone from security design, someone from transport scheduling, and maybe even someone from the counting room.
That sounds like, a lot of people to keep quiet about $30 million.
That's actually one of the biggest challenges with this case. The more people involved, the higher the risk of someone talking, right? But these perpetrators have maintained complete radio silence. No bragging, no suspicious spending patterns that authorities have detected. It's like they've just vanished.
What about surveillance footage? Didn't they catch anything useful on camera?
Well, that's another sign of their sophistication. They strategically disabled key cameras while leaving others operational to avoid triggering certain alarms. And even in the footage that does exist, they're wearing those maintenance uniforms with face coverings that I mentioned. Plus, they seem to know exactly where to position themselves to minimize facial exposure to the cameras that were still working.
So basically, they knew the blind spots?
Exactly. They knew all the blind spots, which again suggests inside knowledge. What's particularly interesting is that investigators believe the actual robbery team might have been hired guns professional thieves brought in by the insiders who had the specific knowledge. This would create a layer of separation protecting the insiders.
Oh wow. That's some Ocean's 11 level planning.
It really is. And the there's something else that's fascinating about this case. The timing of the heist coincided with a period when Gardaworld had recently updated some of their security protocols, but hadn't fully implemented all changes across their network. It was like they knew the company was in a vulnerable transition period.
So they struck when the security was in flux?
Precisely. Which means whoever planned this not only had insider knowledge, but had very current insider knowledge. That's narrowed the investigation to focus on people who would have been aware of these security transition timelines. The FBI has reportedly conducted dozens of interviews with Gardaworld staff, focusing particularly on those with access to this sensitive information.
So what happened after the robbery was discovered? Like, how did the authorities actually respond to all this?
Well, as you can imagine, all hell broke loose. The moment Gardaworld realized they were missing $30 million, they immediately contacted local police, who then quickly brought in the FBI since, we're talking about a massive federal crime here. Within hours, they had established a command center right at the facility and began what would become one of the largest theft investigations in recent history.
That sounds intense. Did they lock down the area or anything?
Oh, absolutely. They implemented what law enforcement calls a concentric circle approach. So they started at the facility itself, processing it as a massive crime scene, and then worked outward. They set up roadblocks, checked surveillance from nearby businesses, tracked all vehicles that had left the area in the hours before and after the heist. But here's the thing. The perpetrators had such a significant head start that these measures were mostly, they were closing the barn door after the horse had bolted, right?
Right. So what about forensic evidence? Did they find anything useful at the scene?
This is where it gets really fascinating, Grace. The crime scene yielded surprisingly little forensic evidence. These thieves were meticulous. They wore gloves the entire time, they used those maintenance uniforms I mentioned, and they even laid down plastic sheeting in certain areas to avoid leaving footprints or trace evidence. And they used some kind of industrial-grade cleaning solution on anything they did touch.
Wow, that's incredibly thorough. Almost like they knew exactly what investigators would be looking for.
Exactly. That's what makes investigators believe that someone with law enforcement or security background might be involved. They demonstrated knowledge of not just Gardaworld's security protocols, but also modern forensic investigation techniques. They even avoided using cell phones anywhere near the facility, knowing that cell tower data could place them at the scene.
What about witness testimonies? Did anyone see anything unusual?
There were actually several witnesses, but their accounts have been, let's say, limited in usefulness. A few employees reported seeing the maintenance crew, but because they were wearing authorized uniforms and had apparently valid credentials, nothing seemed out of place. It's one of those hiding in plain sight scenarios, you know what I mean? The witnesses simply didn't realize they were observing a crime in progress.
Did any of the cameras capture anything useful at all?
Despite their best efforts to avoid detection, investigators did manage to piece together some surveillance footage. The thieves disabled many cameras, but they couldn't get them all without triggering alarms. So there is some footage, but it's fragmented. The FBI's technical team has been enhancing what little they have, looking at things like body movements, height estimates, and even how they carried themselves.
You can tell something from how someone walks?
Absolutely. It's called gait analysis, and it's surprisingly effective. Everyone has a unique way of moving, right? Experts can sometimes identify individuals just by analyzing their walking pattern. In this case, they've determined that at least one of the thieves had military or law enforcement training based on their tactical movements and positioning during the heist.
That's crazy. What about the getaway vehicles? Couldn't they track those?
The investigators believe the thieves used multiple vehicles in a relay system. They've identified what they think was the first vehicle, a nondescript white van with stolen plates, from surveillance footage about 2 miles from the facility. But here's the clever part. They believe the money was transferred to a second vehicle, possibly a commercial truck that wouldn't attract attention, and then likely to a third, each transfer happening in locations with minimal surveillance.
So they basically made it impossible to follow a single trail?
Precisely. And what's really sophisticated is that they apparently used what's called a cold site for at least one of these transfers, a location they had never visited before and would never return to. This prevents any connection between the criminals and the location through cell records, credit card transactions, or even routine patterns of movement.
Have they made any progress at all in identifying suspects?
There have been some developments, though nothing conclusive yet. About 3 months into the investigation, Authorities detained a former Gardaworld employee for questioning, but they didn't have enough evidence to hold him. They've also been monitoring dark web forums and criminal networks for any chatter about the heist or sudden movement of large amounts of cash. But these criminals have been remarkably disciplined about not drawing attention to themselves.
So they're just sitting on $30 million somewhere?
That's what makes this so interesting from an investigative standpoint. 30 million in cash is extremely difficult to move or spend without raising flags. The FBI believes the money is likely being aged right now, stored somewhere secure while heat from the investigation dies down. And, they're probably planning to launder it very slowly, over many years, through legitimate-looking businesses.
So how does this Gardaworld heist, compare to other famous robberies we've seen? It seems pretty extraordinary to me.
Oh, it absolutely stands out, Grace, but there are some fascinating parallels with other major heists throughout history. I mean, if we're looking at pure dollar amounts, the Gardaworld theft doesn't actually top the list. The largest cash robbery in U.S. history is still the 1997 Dunbar Armored Facility robbery in Los Angeles, where thieves took nearly $19 million, which is about $30 million in today's money, so roughly comparable to our case.
What made that one similar or different?
The Dunbar case was definitely an inside job, which is a major similarity. One of the facility's employees orchestrated the whole thing and recruited 5 childhood friends to help. They had intimate knowledge of the security protocols, cameras, everything. Sound familiar? But the Gardaworld thieves seem to have been much more sophisticated about covering their tracks. The Dunbar crew actually got caught because they started, flashing their newfound wealth around too quickly.
So patience might be the key difference here, right?
Exactly. And if we look across the pond, the 2006 Tunbridge Depot robbery in England saw thieves take off with about £53 million, which is around $70 million. That one had elements we've seen in our case too. They kidnapped the facility manager's family to force his cooperation, and they used elaborate disguises and police uniforms. The professionalism, the planning, it's all very similar.
What about that movie-like heist? The one in Boston? The Brinks job?
Oh yeah. The 1950 Great Brinks robbery was legendary. $2.7 million taken, which would be about $30 million today, actually. And the similarities are striking. The thieves spent nearly 2 years planning it. They had inside information, and they wore Halloween masks and chauffeur uniforms. They even managed to defeat what was considered an impenetrable security system at the time. But here's where our Gardaworld thieves learned from history. The Brinks robbers were eventually caught because they just couldn't keep quiet. One of them started talking. You know what I mean?
So the discipline of these Gardaworld thieves is what makes them different?
That's a huge part of it, yeah. Another interesting comparison is the 1978 Lufthansa heist at JFK Airport. The one immortalized in Goodfellas? They took about $5.8 million, which is roughly $23 million today. Similar figures. But what's fascinating is that the Lufthansa robbery fell apart because the thieves started killing each other out of paranoia and greed. Our Gardaworld crew seems to have avoided that fatal flaw.
Is there anything totally unique about this case compared to those others?
The timing and technological sophistication really stand out. Most major heists like this happened before the era of ubiquitous surveillance, cell phone tracking, and digital forensics. The fact that they pulled this off in an age where your every movement can be tracked makes it remarkable. They clearly understood not just physical security, but digital security too. They knew exactly how to navigate around modern investigative techniques that simply didn't exist during those classic heists.
That's honestly terrifying when you think about it.
It really is. And there's one more thing that makes this case unique. Most successful large-scale heists throughout history have eventually been solved. The perpetrators are usually caught, often years later, because maintaining the conspiracy becomes impossible. Someone talks, someone spends too much, relationships fall apart. The fact that this crew has maintained complete discipline suggests an unusual level of professionalism we don't typically see in robbery crews, even sophisticated ones.
So when we really get down to it, what actually went wrong with Gardaworld's security systems here? I mean, this is a company that's literally built on being secure, right?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Or I guess the $30 million question in this case. Looking at what went wrong, there were, multiple catastrophic failures that all happened simultaneously. First and foremost, there was clearly a breakdown in their personnel vetting process. The fact that someone with inside knowledge was able to participate or at least provide critical information, that's a massive red flag right there.
But don't they do background checks and stuff?
Oh, absolutely they do. But the problem is, background checks only reveal what's already known, you know? They don't predict future behavior. And sometimes people can work somewhere for years building trust before they decide to do something like this. The other major failure was in their transport protocols. Gardaworld had apparently fallen into predictable patterns with their routes and timing, which is basically security suicide when you're moving that much cash.
Wouldn't they know better than that, though?
You'd think so, but it's actually a really common problem in security. See, when nothing goes wrong for years and years, companies start getting complacent. They cut corners to save money, maybe reduce the number of guards on a transport, or they don't vary their routes enough because it's more efficient logistically to take the same path. It's human nature, but it's dangerous.
So, what changes did they implement after this whole disaster?
The industry response was actually pretty dramatic. Gardaworld specifically did a complete overhaul of their hiring and background check procedures. They now do continuous monitoring of employees rather than just pre-employment screening. They've also implemented what they call random route generation, where even the drivers don't know their exact route until the last minute, and they change vehicles more frequently.
That seems like common sense, though, doesn't it?
It totally does in hindsight. But here's another big change. Many security companies now use multiple vehicle convoys with decoy trucks. They've also significantly upgraded their GPS tracking technology. Some have even started using vehicles with remote lockdown capabilities, so if there's an unauthorized stop, the entire truck just locks itself down completely and can only be opened from a remote location.
Technology to the rescue, I guess.
In some ways, yeah. There's also been this industry-wide move toward using less cash altogether. Some armored car companies are actually pivoting their business models to focus more on cybersecurity now because physical cash is, gradually becoming less common. But one of the most interesting changes has been psychological screening. Companies now regularly evaluate employees for signs of financial distress or unusual behavior that might indicate vulnerability to recruitment by criminals.
Do you think all these changes are actually enough to prevent something like this from happening again?
Honestly, no, I don't. The reality is that security is always this cat-and-mouse game. Every new measure creates a new challenge for criminals to overcome, and eventually someone figures out a way around it. The truly concerning thing is that as we implement more technological solutions, we potentially create new vulnerabilities. What happens when someone hacks the remote lockdown system, right?
That's a scary thought.
It really is. And there's always the human element, which is simultaneously the strongest and weakest link in any security system. No matter how sophisticated your technology gets, if someone on the inside decides to help thieves, they can potentially bypass almost any security measures. Some industry experts are advocating for more frequent rotation of employees between routes and facilities to prevent them from gaining too much specialized knowledge about any one system, but that creates its own problems with expertise and efficiency.
So it sounds like we're still pretty vulnerable despite all these changes?
Unfortunately, yes. While the specific vulnerabilities that were exploited in the Gardaworld Heist have been addressed, the fundamental challenge remains. As long as there's $30 million sitting in a truck somewhere, someone's going to try to figure out how to take it. The most effective deterrent isn't actually the security measures themselves, but the knowledge that most heist perpetrators eventually get caught, even if it takes years.
So after all of this, how much of the money was actually recovered? I mean, $30 million is just sitting out there somewhere, right?
So that's the thing that makes this case so frustrating. To date, only about $8 million of the original $30 million has been recovered, and most of that was found during the initial raids when they arrested the first few suspects. The rest of it is just gone, completely vanished. And, cash is still incredibly difficult to trace once it's been physically removed from the financial system.
But don't they have, serial numbers and stuff they can track?
They do, absolutely. But the reality is that large bills can be slowly filtered back into circulation through businesses that deal with a lot of cash transactions. Or they might have already moved it offshore to countries with more relaxed banking regulations. Some investigators even believe a significant portion might still be sitting in storage somewhere, waiting for things to cool down before they try to use it.
And what about prosecutions? Have they actually caught anyone?
Yes, so far 7 people have been arrested in connection with the heist. 3 of them were former Gardaworld employees, which definitely confirms the inside job theory. But here's the interesting part. Only 4 of those 7 have actually been convicted. The others are either awaiting trial or, in one case, the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. The sentences for those convicted range from 8 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement.
That doesn't sound like a lot of time for stealing $30 million.
Right? When you do the math, it's like, even if they never recover another dollar, the people who got away with portions of that money are essentially being paid millions for doing a few years in prison. Not exactly a strong deterrent. And the suspected mastermind behind the whole operation still hasn't been identified or captured, at least not publicly.
What about Gardaworld itself? I'm guessing this wasn't exactly good for business.
Oh man, the corporate fallout was brutal. Their stock dropped nearly 30% in the weeks following the heist. They faced multiple lawsuits from clients whose money was stolen, and their insurance premiums absolutely skyrocketed, not just for Gardaworld, but for the entire armored transport industry. Some smaller security companies were actually forced out of business because they couldn't afford the new insurance rates.
Did insurance cover the losses?
Most of it, yeah. Gardaworld had insurance policies that covered about 85% of the stolen funds, but that still left them on the hook for around $4.5 million, plus all the reputational damage, which is honestly harder to quantify but probably cost them way more in lost business. They also had to spend millions upgrading their security protocols and retraining staff. And their executive team. Complete shakeup. The COO resigned, and they brought in new leadership from outside the company to try to restore confidence.
Has it worked? Like, are they back on their feet now?
They've stabilized, for sure, but they're still dealing with the consequences. Their market share in the cash transport business is down about 15% from pre-heist levels. The company has actually been pivoting toward other security services where they haven't taken such a reputation hit. The interesting thing is that some clients have come back because Gardaworld now has arguably some of the most stringent security measures in the industry.
Born from a very expensive lesson.
I guess sometimes you have to learn the hard way.
Exactly. And there's been this ripple effect throughout the entire industry. Insurance companies now require much more detailed security plans before they'll even consider covering large cash transports. Many banks have reduced their maximum cash shipment amounts, preferring to make more frequent, smaller transfers. And some retailers that used to keep large amounts of cash on hand have switched to almost entirely digital payment systems, just to avoid the headache and expense.
So in some weird way, this heist might have actually accelerated the move away from physical cash?
100%. It's like this perfect storm that's been pushing us toward a more cashless society. The pandemic already had people using less physical money, and then incidents like this make institutions realize just how vulnerable cash really is. I mean, you can't exactly hijack a digital transfer with a couple of stolen vehicles and some inside information, right?
So I guess that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Gardaworld heist. What a case, right?
Absolutely. And I think what fascinates me most about this whole thing is just the sheer audacity, you know? $30 million taken in basically minutes after months, maybe even years of planning. It's like watching a high-stakes chess game where one side was thinking 10 moves ahead.
Yeah, and the fact that most of the money is still missing. That's just mind-blowing to me. Like, there's over 20 million just floating around out there somewhere?
Exactly. And the reality is that some of that cash might never be recovered. I mean, think about it. With every year that passes, the trail gets colder, witnesses forget details, evidence deteriorates. It's possible that decades from now, someone might stumble across a hidden stash of cash that traces back to this heist, you know what I mean?
That would be such a wild discovery. I also can't get over the inside job element. Like, people who were trusted with protecting millions just deciding to steal it instead.
It really makes you wonder about human nature, doesn't it? The temptation of life-changing money versus years of building a career and reputation. And for what? A few $1,000,000 in a prison sentence? Yet people keep making that calculation and deciding the risk is worth it.
Well, as usual, thanks for bringing us another fascinating case for Case Closed. I always learn so much from these conversations.
My pleasure. I'm always excited to dig into these stories with you. And hey, speaking of fascinating cases,
Next week, we're going to be looking at something completely different but equally mind-blowing. We'll be covering the infamous Black Dahlia murder that shocked 1940s Hollywood and remains unsolved to this day.
Oh, I've heard bits and pieces about that one. Super creepy and mysterious, right?
Incredibly creepy and full of bizarre twists and turns. It's one of those cases that's generated countless theories but no definitive answers. Even after, 75 years, you're going to be absolutely fascinated by some of the evidence we'll be discussing.
Can't wait. And thank you all for listening to this episode of Case Closed. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And leave us a review if you have a moment. We love hearing what you think. Until next time, case closed.